Hello and welcome to the Daily Politics as Theresa May prepares to face questions from MPs about her decision to approve airstrikes in Syria. Opposition parties say Parliament should have been consulted before the UK joined the US and France in the bombing, which Jeremy Corbyn calls a knee-jerk response. Pictures of the suspected chemical attack which led to the airstrikes shocked the world. But what impact have the attacks really had on the conflict in Syria? Thousands of children of the Windrush generation have been told they are in the UK illegally. We'll ask the government if they face being deported.
You're going to do police your kid or bury your kid. It's one of the two, man.
Amid rising concern over knife crime and violence on our streets, we'll be talking to some of those affected and asking what is the answer. They say it's not a second referendum. We talk to the new campaign demanding a people's vote before we leave the EU. All that in the next hour. And with us for the whole of the programme today, the Conservative MP Johnny Mercer and the Labour MP Catherine West. Welcome to both of you. Theresa May will be appearing in the Commons in a few hours' time to defend her decision to join military action in Syria. We don't yet know whether that debate will lead to a vote and what that vote might mean. But we'll be trying to answer that and some of the big questions about those airstrikes. Johnny Mercer, can I start with you? The Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson said yesterday that these strikes were not intended to turn or affect the war in Syria. So what were they intended to do?
Well, they were clearly intended to deter the use of chemical weapons. I mean, he's absolutely right. There is no easy answer to Syria. There's no clean outcome that's going to come from this. These strikes were very carefully calibrated and very deliberately targeted against that chemical weapons use that Bashar al-Assad used against his own people. They've achieved the objective. And frankly, I mean, we were discussing earlier how the debate has kind of moved on in other countries, and we kind of need to as well. There are so many factors at play in Syria that we need to understand what they are and really, try and influence that, yes, through political situations as well. But when that line is crossed around chemical weapons, and I'm afraid we act in the way that we've done, the Prime Minister's done absolutely right thing.
So you say a line was crossed, and the government says the same in terms of chemical weapons being used in Syria. But why doesn't the government intervene? And people will be confused as to why they see that as more horrific than weapons that are used that aren't chemical weapons, but are just as horrific in terms of killing people.
Yeah, no, it's a fair point. But I think the issue around chemical weapons is actually very clear. In 1993, we signed up to a legally binding treaty that these were to be outlawed. And it becomes a duty of those who sign that treaty that when they are used, that then we step up and we do something about it. I totally accept your point that there is no disparity in the death between those who are killed by chemical weapons and those who are killed in the conflict. But again, I don't think that's the answer to do nothing when chemical weapons are used.
And isn't that the point, Catherine West? I mean, what better reason is there to launch military action and airstrikes when women and children have been gassed?
Look, there's absolutely no doubt. Those photographs of the children, the images, it's disgraceful. And I think, Assad, there's probably enough evidence to have him in The Hague. The question is when, how do we get him there? But I want to pick up a point that Boris Johnson made when he said that peace was an extra. Because he said at the end of his statement, well, that's an extra. And I think that really misses the point, because in order to stop this altogether, we need to get back round the table, we need to start talking again, and we need to bring real and lasting peace to this terrible civil war.
Right, but we're just talking about the airstrikes here. The Foreign Secretary was clear that this is not going to change or solve the course of the war. You said something there. You are convinced, then, that it's Bashar al-Assad behind this chemical attack?
I think over the last 7 years we have enough evidence to charge him for crimes in The Hague, whether this particular one, because I'm not a weapons inspector and they're still looking at them.
Although there was clear evidence from intelligence experts, from the French, and as well as our own government.
There have been 50 uses of chemical weapons in the last sort of 10 years. So I think that we know that in that part of the world, sadly, these weapons are still being sold. We need to look at who's selling them.
Sure.
There is a real problem, and I'm a big believer in the international conventions, which we need to uphold.
Right, but was there enough basis then, from what you've said, to launch this strike?
Well, that's what I want to hear from the Prime Minister this afternoon, because, of course, backbench MPs like us still haven't really had a chance to ask. And this isn't just any conflict, is it? There are 13 different partners, nations involved in this terrible conflict, and it's a tinderbox. And I'm very worried that we haven't had those conversations when actually we could have. We could have been recalled on Saturday to have that debate.
All right, we're going to talk more about this, obviously, in the programme. Now, we've been talking about the Foreign Secretary, Boris Johnson. Well, here he is explaining the thinking behind the strikes at a meeting of foreign ministers in Luxembourg earlier today.
It is very important to stress this was not an attempt to change the tide of the war in Syria or to have a regime change or to get rid of Bashar al-Assad. I'm afraid the Syrian war in many ways will go on in its horrible, miserable way. But it was the world saying that we've had enough of the use of chemical weapons, the erosion of that taboo that has been in place for 100 years has gone too far under Bashar al-Assad, and it was time that we said no. And I think it was totally, therefore, the right thing to do.
Well, that was Boris Johnson. We're joined here in the studio by Deborah Haynes. She's the defence editor of The Times, and by Rosemary Hollis. She's a specialist on the Middle East. Welcome to both of you. Can I start with you, first of all, Deborah? It was done to deter and degrade chemical weapons in Syria. Has it done that?
It's definitely degraded the chemical weapons facilities. I mean, that's demonstrable from the aerial footage. And we know that the research centre in Damascus in particular that was hit, there's been intelligence reports that was being actively used as part of the chemical weapons programme. So, yes, it's been degraded. Whether or not it's going to be a deterrent remains to be seen.
But it did happen, the strikes happened about a week after the chemical attack in Douma, and we know that there were channels open between the Americans and the Russians. So was there time to move some of that stuff out of those sites?
I don't think it's that easy to move the actual chemical products. And also, a lot of that, I mean, it's a laboratory, and so it's going to be laboratory equipment. I'm sure they would have moved maybe some things. There's evidence of them moving military equipment. So we know that they moved, like the Syrian Air Force moved a lot of its jets onto the Russian Air Force base that's in Latakia. But I don't think they could have moved all of it.
What about other groups that might have carried out this attack? Jeremy Corbyn talked about the possibility that other groups could have been responsible. But is it credible that other groups would have had access to aircraft to drop the bombs that had the gas?
It just is not credible. And the thing that we have to remember that this is that warfare in this century is not just about bombs and bullets. There's always been an information element, like a propaganda element to war. But in the 21st century, when you've got social media, when everybody has an opinion that they can voice to the world, that becomes a really powerful tool of influence. And so the idea that these sort of conspiracy theories, lots of them promulgated by Russia-backed trolls and bots, are being used to influence our population, divide public opinion, exploit the very real concerns that people have because they don't want to see another rerun of dodgy dossiers and Iraq war type situations. But we have to be really alive to the fact that our democracy is being exploited.
All right, let's move on to the legal position, because over the weekend the government published its legal position on the strikes in Syria. They argued that military force can be legally used for humanitarian intervention if these three conditions are met. Firstly, there is convincing evidence of extreme humanitarian distress requiring immediate and urgent relief. Secondly, there is no practicable alternative to the use of force if lives are to be saved. And thirdly, the proposed use of force must be necessary and proportionate. Rosemary, what do you make of the legal basis for the airstrikes?
Well, I think it provides a legal basis for the use of force by international players in Syria. Whether it is exactly aligned with the reasons for the strike being made now in the way it was, and as a result of the concerns that the Americans, the British and the French had, is another matter. So lawyers will dispute whether the strikes fitted exactly with the terms that you've just read out. I, and I'm not a lawyer, can already think of some questions as a result of the conditions that are set out for action, in other words, that it's going to immediately save lives and you need to move now in order to save lives, well, that's not the case. The attack took place. It's too late to prevent that attack. There's simply an assumption that by striking, further attacks will be prevented. But as Deborah said, we don't know yet whether that will have the desired deterrent effect. And also, it's justified on humanitarian grounds, which is rather at odds with what the French government, the British government and the American government have been saying. They say it's to uphold the Chemical Weapons Convention and that taking action because they believe that Assad has flouted the convention that he was forced to sign in 2013, and they have held the Russians responsible for not keeping him to that. So this is about a larger set of issues than just humanitarian assistance.
You pointed to some inconsistencies there. In terms of the UN route that Labour and Jeremy Corbyn has talked about, was that exhausted in your view?
Technically, no. But I think it's well understood that things have reached a stage in the UN Security Council where there is not going to be agreement on exactly what should happen in Syria. Now, these strikes have revived the argument about needing to have a peaceful solution, needing to have negotiations between all the parties. What has been the problem with the Geneva process, which is the UN's process for resolving this conflict, is that not all the rebels are allowed to the table by the Assad regime, so it doesn't constitute a way to get agreement between the warring parties. And secondly, the Saudis have tended to block the participation of the Iranians, but you have to have them there if you're to resolve this conflict. And the British and American and French have wanted to see the process foreshadow the absence of Assad, even if not immediately.
All right.
They want to see him go, and that has been a blockage with the Russians and the Chinese, for that matter,
What do you make of you've just heard there?
Well, that's what I was getting at, because, of course, I think there's probably evidence on other things. I mean, a leader who refuses medicines to small children, a leader who stops food coming in one city, so part of the city has no food and the rest of the city. There's so many other things that you could probably find in a court of law that has broken humanitarian law.
But let's just pick up on
So
it.
I agree that Assad does have to be held to account. The question is whether what we've done is going to get us towards that goal or not.
Right. Well, let's pick up on a few. Let's go back to what Deborah said, first of all, that it's not credible that other groups could have launched and committed that chemical attack. Why does Jeremy Corbyn persist in even entertaining that idea?
Well, I heard Lord West say this morning, no relation, by the way, and we don't have to go to Russian bots, he's in the House of Lords, I think, saying something very similar about this is sort of where we've got to in the war, and why would Assad want to do that right now? That was the sort of argument. Now, that's
just his opinion. It wasn't based on any sort of secret
there's
intelligence.
No evidence for that at all.
And probably,
Does it help entertaining that idea if there is no evidence to back it up?
Well, the thing is that members of Parliament rely on experts for evidence, and he was very senior in the military, was he not? So all I'm saying is that I don't think it's just Jeremy making something up.
But we're also being told that we can't have the evidence because it's classified.
Right. Well, let's talk about the legal basis that Rosemary was discussing. Johnny Mercer, are you completely reassured by the legal basis? Because even Dominic Grieve, on your own side, says it's debatable on humanitarian grounds.
I think this whole debate is becoming slightly sort of disingenuous of our country in a way, because absolutely everybody understands that you try and do these things with a strong legal framework in the right manner, in a very calibrated and precise way.
And shouldn't you?
And that is what precisely the government have done. Now, you can come back after the event and argue, well, Jeremy Corbyn's saying that perhaps it was staged, and other people are saying, well, was there really a humanitarian thing? But if you look at it in the round, as the Prime Minister has to do, her moral case and her legal case and her strategic case are very, very clear. And the more we sort of procrastinate about this, we're emasculating ourselves internationally, and it's just not helpful to, us trying to play a legitimate an important role in the world.
But Johnny, you and I have a role in this too, because we're answerable to our constituents. It's not Mr. Trump with his button, is it? This is a parliamentary democracy where I am accountable to the 80,000. Hang on, let me finish.
David
I'm accountable to the 80,000 electors in Hornsey and Wood Green, and they they want to know that I am here asking questions in Parliament today, but I think they share my disappointment that if it's such a robust case, why couldn't we have the debate on Saturday or Friday, and then she could have made the strike then?
And we're going to come on to that in just a moment. Thank you very much for coming in, both of you. Now, let's talk more about the political fallout from Friday's military action. Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn was asked yesterday by the BBC's Andrew Marr whether there should now be a vote on military action in Syria.
Yes, I would, because I think Parliament should have a say in this, and the Prime Minister could quite easily have done that. She took a decision sometime last week that she was going to work with Macron and Trump in order to have an attack on the chemical weapons establishments in Syria. She could have recalled Parliament last week. It's only the Prime Minister that can recall Parliament. Or she could have delayed until tomorrow when Parliament returns itself. There is precedent over previous interventions where Parliament has had a vote. And I think what we need in this country is something more robust, like a War Powers Act, so that governments do get held to account by Parliament for what they do in our name.
Jeremy Corbyn. Well, we're joined now by two journalists. They both work for websites, which is very modern of us, of course, up to date as we are. It's Emily Ashton from BuzzFeed and Owen Bennett from The Huffington Post. Welcome to both of you. Emily, first of all, is the Prime Minister in trouble over this?
The opposition are not happy. The opposition front bench are not happy that she didn't come to the House last week. They say, yes, Parliament was on recess, Easter recess, but you could have recalled it on Friday. You could have even recalled it on Saturday, they say, and given MPs the chance to have their say and also have a vote, as previous Prime Ministers have come to Parliament for a vote. So she will face a fair few questions in her statement this afternoon, but probably not from her own side on this, who seem to be behind her.
I mean, Owen Bennett, there may well be a vote in Parliament. We're going to be discussing that further in a moment. What will the significance of that be now?
Well, it could potentially, if it's voted down, if you like, it could potentially tie Theresa May's hands for any future action. It could make it even more difficult for her to go forward without parliamentary approval in the future. But actually, it's just going to give people like Jeremy Corbyn and people on his sort of worldview the chance to get on record the fact that they were against this and they were against it, certainly without consulting Parliament. But what it might actually further do is highlight the divisions on the Labour side, because there'll be plenty of people on the Labour benches who totally agree with what Theresa May did and totally agree that Theresa May acted quickly and without coming to Parliament.
Right. There are critics on the Tory side too, though, aren't there, Emily?
Yes, well, there have been people like Julian Lewis, the chair of the Defence Select Committee, who said last week, you know, Theresa May should be giving Parliament a say on this. And he was a bit disgruntled at the time that she hasn't. But there doesn't seem to be that level of debate as to whether the action itself was wrong. As you see from Jeremy Corbyn and others on the Labour front bench, you don't really see that from the Tory side. And if you look at Twitter, for example, all the tweets from the Tory MPs seem to be very supportive of what Theresa May did.
Right. I mean, where are we now in terms of a vote in the House of Commons? Because we know there's going to be this debate this afternoon. Are MPs going to vote on a substantive motion?
Well, there's a suggestion that Theresa May is going to try and push for a vote today, but that vote would be on whether the House has considered the debate, if you like. So not actually a vote on whether or not the strike should have taken place. Obviously, Labour would try and push for a more meaningful vote. I think Theresa May wants to get this all out of the way today. Remember, there's an anti-Semitism debate planned for tomorrow, which the Tories would like to go ahead because they think that can embarrass Jeremy Corbyn, embarrass the Labour Party. So Theresa May clearly wants to get this all wrapped up as soon as possible. Doesn't want it to drag on any longer than it has to.
All right, thank you both very much. We'll be in the House, no doubt, this afternoon. We're joined now here in the studio by the leader of the SNP at Westminster, Ian Blackford. He's called the weekend action a smokescreen and is asking for a vote in the Commons. Ian, are you going to have a vote? Are you going to demand a vote this afternoon?
Well, we should have had a vote before action took place. So we're now, of course, having to deal with the fact that military action has taken place. Let me be clear that all of us abhor chemical weapons. We want to see an end to the war in Syria. We want to see an end to the humanitarian crisis. I don't think the action that took place over the weekend really deals with that. And we need to make sure that, given the circumstances, this is a minority government. The precedent was set in 2015 and indeed before, when military action took place against Daesh. The government came to Parliament and sought the approval of Parliament. That's what should have happened. Parliament should have been recalled. We now need to make sure we can have a vote on a substantial motion,
right,
recognising that Parliament has to be consulted.
Where are you with that?
Well, we need to try and find a mechanism to do that. We were obviously pushing for a debate today. The government knew that, which is why Theresa May has come with this SO24 action that she is doing. The government should have used its own time to bring forward its own debate on a substantive motion. We need to make sure that we can use the parliamentary machinery.
So you are
this.
trying to find a mechanism in Parliament to call for a vote on a substantive motion on the airstrikes themselves and whether Parliament should have been consulted.
Well,
but the airstrikes,
that's happened.
exactly, the airstrikes have happened. So what's the point?
Well, I think what we need to do is have a motion that would recognise that the government has to come to Parliament to seek authority for any future action. I think that should be the fundamental point.
And what's wrong with that? I mean, why shouldn't Parliament be consulted? I mean, it was an excuse, wasn't it, not to recall MPs at the weekend or delay by a couple of days, bearing in mind we'd already had this week gap. And then there would have been a parliamentary consensus behind Theresa May's action.
So, Joe, you sit here week in, week out, and you want from members of Parliament to make evidence-based decisions based on what is going on. It's very clear that parliamentarians must have a say in this. They must have a debate. But the idea that they can then bind the government's hand on military action is insane, because they will never see the full picture of what is going on. And if we do that, we are completely emasculating ourselves and inhibiting our ability to act on the world stage. I mean, it's not good for the country.
I mean, and that is true. You've been neutering a government. A government's prerogative to go to war or launch military action.
No, I would simply say to Johnny and others that we need to make sure that we do our work here. We need to make sure the weapons inspectors, the OPCW, can do the necessary analysis. There has to be a unanimity of all of us that the use of chemical weapons ought to be forbidden, period. There can be absolutely no debate about that. The principle of this are important, and the fact remains that the government has come to Parliament in the past before taking action. There was no reason why the government had to rush into action with the Americans and with the French over the course of the weekend.
Right, can I just clarify one thing?
One thing which is important, if I may, that I did ask the Prime Minister in the middle of last week. She was calling a cabinet meeting asking for authority. She could have recalled Parliament at that stage, and she could have then been informed by the decision that Parliament takes. I absolutely accept that Parliament cannot involve itself in operational matters.
Right.
Of course not.
And you don't have access to the intelligence that obviously some people are privy to.
Well, some are, and I've been lucky enough as a third-party leader that some of that has been shared with me, and I'm grateful that the government has done that and that we have been
All right,
consulted.
but what difference, what material difference would it have made if we'd waited for the inspectors from the OPCW to have gone in, the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, to go in? They are not tasked with deciding who is to blame. So what would be the point of delaying and waiting for them?
One of the big challenges we face here is the split that there is between the West and Russia. And we need to be able to present the evidence to Russia as to what has happened. We have to break this logjam, and it would have been much easier to do that if we can show definitively what has happened, because there are people that deny...
Are you saying that the OPCW says, look, we've got evidence here that proves who made the chemical weapons, who was storing it and who used it, that the Russians are going to suddenly say, you're right, hands up, we confess, if they are the ones responsible?
Let's be serious about this. That's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is the OPCW have got an important role to play, as indeed does the World Health Organization, and we need to put pressure on Russia in order that they can force the Syrians to recognise that the use of chemical weapons cannot be tolerated. Of course there have to be sanctions.
But the Russians were asked the last time to put pressure on Syria to degrade their chemical weapons, and it didn't work.
I accept that, but the fundamental issue here is 500,000 people have now lost their lives in Syria. We need to redouble our efforts to end this humanitarian crisis. It's not just about this attack and the fact that we had a gesture over the course of the weekend.
There are two things I just need to clarify.
Than that.
If there had been a debate beforehand, and I know this is counterfactual in that sense, do you and would you support the airstrikes in order to degrade the chemical weapons of Bashar al-Assad?
We need to build a consensus globally that can lead...
So
I would not have supported
You would not have supported... OK, fine. Do you support Labour's call for a War Powers Act?
That's been our position for many years that we've been asking for this.
Excuse me then for not realising. So you would have the SNP support on the War Powers Act?
Because William Hague said it in 2011, that's what he supported, and he was very good on foreign affairs. And secondly, we know from Chilcot that it is almost a recommendation that comes out of that very long and thoughtful report.
But it would bind any government's hands, wouldn't it?
Well, it would make the government present the material in a way, it's to get away from the dodgy dossier concept, which actually, it feels all very real and we know the answers today, but the inspectors haven't even finished their work yet.
Right.
And we do have to have evidence. We have to have evidence-based decision-making. And that was a very strong recommendation from Chilcot. The other one was a plan. I don't feel as though there's a plan.
Right.
It feels like
but do you accept chemical weapons were used?
I accept chemical weapons were used
right.
from the photographs which we've seen, yes.
So if chemical weapons were used, and this was an airstrike to degrade chemical weapons facility and capability to be used again, where's the problem?
The problem is in failing to consult Parliament, because if it's such a fantastic plan, then great, let's all get behind it. It looks as though there was a reason why the Prime Minister didn't want us there. Ian and I and Johnny, we all ask really good questions.
Right, and isn't that... Well, hang on, I just need to ask for Johnny's reaction. Yeah. What's wrong with the War Powers Act? William Hague was in favour.
Yes,
David Cameron thought it would be a good safeguard. So why not now?
William Hague has very clearly said this morning that he agrees with it in terms of the issues around Iraq, for example, around 2003. But on issues of this, a clear and calibrated action to attack chemical weapons facilities, he said that's not what he had in mind this morning, and he said that this morning. All I would say to those who advocate for this is that if there was a piece of intelligence that was so critical to making this decision, but to reveal it was going to burn that asset and make this country less safe, would you still say that we must lay that in the public domain just so Parliament is happy? And I think we elect a Prime Minister to make those decisions, and it's right that she's done what she has, and I fully support her in that.
Right.
I think the majority of the
Joe,
country
you can't
does
get
too.
away from the fact that Mr Trump has had a hand in this, because he was the one tweeting at the end of last week saying we have to do this, which is what gave us the timetable.
Now,
and we can't just have Mr Trump's timetable, because we have a parliamentary democracy which is much more considered, and we don't just have that sort of
so the
presidential style.
There is a fair point here.
She's not a president.
The government do need to go out and advocate better for what we're trying to do and bring the country with them. I totally accept that, and I think we've seen efforts to do that, certainly since the weekend.
Retrospectively.
That is a fair point. But the idea that Trump, I'm afraid, dictates our foreign policy is I'm afraid, for the birds.
We can't lose sight of the fact that the Americans did take military action in 2017 to degrade Syrian chemical weapons. It didn't work. And that is a fundamental point. We need to make sure that we deal with this crisis acting with our partners globally, but we need to deal with the source of the problem, which is the war, which is the instability in that country. The action in itself is not going to do that.
All right, well, we haven't got enough time to further discuss Russia at this point, but thank you very much for coming in. The government is facing questions today over its treatment of the children of Windrush generation migrants. Some of those who came to Britain as children have been threatened with deportation to countries they left 50 years ago and haven't returned to since because immigration rules have been tightened. Those affected do not have sufficient paperwork to prove they have the right to be here or stay here. More than 140 MPs from all parties have signed a letter to Theresa May expressing concern. Earlier, I spoke to the High Commissioner for Barbados, Guy Hewitt, who has requested a meeting with Home Office ministers. I began by asking him what he has made of the UK's response.
It's a start, but there's a long way to go. We have been in contact with the Home Office and we have asked them for a sit down, because I think they are getting information from within the Home Office, from their officials, that seems to suggest that this is not the crisis that it really is for us, and more importantly, for the Caribbean migrants who came to this country many, many years ago.
So you've contacted the Home Office. Have they agreed to meet you and sit down and talk about this?
No, they have not. They've heard the request, and we are hoping that they will agree to it, because they need to understand how acute this situation is. You're dealing with people who came over here, many of them as children. They're calling them now the Windrush kids, who came here, went to school, got educated, got jobs, raised families, paid their taxes, and in their twilight years, they are being told, because they did not regularize their status, that they are being treated as illegal immigrants. And this is the challenge. It's not that they are being told the Home Office will work with you. Some of them, they're being shut out of the system. They can't work. They can't access benefits. Some are still in detention. Others have been deported.
The Minister says that the door to the Home Office is open. It's open now. It's open to anybody from that Windrush generation to come and sort out the documentation so that they can stay.
I have two responses to that. The first is, based on past experience, we advise people do not approach the Home Office unless they first notify their high commissions, their lawyers, or immigration charity. People have gone to the Home Office and have been sent from there into detention. That is a reality. In addition to that, going to the Home Office, and the Home Office has not yet committed itself to sort out the records. They're making records available so these people can regularize the status. The onus is being put on the individual to prove that they were here before 1971. I don't have any personal records dating back employment or education, so I don't expect them to. We have said to the Home Office, you can access to the government, HMRC data, NHS data, NIS data. That will prove a history of people in this country. Use it to help them. We have got no commitment that they were willing to do that yet.
Why do you think the government is failing to understand the severity of this crisis, as you call it?
I would say in part because the West Indian community has always acted with a certain amount of difference towards this country. They came here from countries that were colonies. This was the mother country. Most of these countries are realm. Her Majesty is the Queen of Barbados, the Queen of Jamaica, the Queen of St. Kitts and Nevis, the Queen of many of our countries. So for them, coming here was like a journey home. And I think many of them are distressed and trying to come to terms with why they would be rejected by the country that they considered home and made home. As the leaders gather as a Commonwealth family, they will bring attention to the value of the Commonwealth and Caribbean citizens to this country over time, and the government will act with compassion and urgency to resolve the situation.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So that's the view of the High Commissioner of Barbados, and I put some of those points to the Immigration Minister, Caroline Nokes.
I think we've taken the concerns very seriously, and I'm determined that the Windrush generation have a message from me, which is one of reassurance, to get in contact with the Home Office, because we are absolutely determined to make sure that their status is settled, agreed, so there can be no more questions going forward.
So why haven't you agreed to meet the Barbadian High Commissioner? He's just spoken to us to say that he requested a meeting and none has been forthcoming.
Well, I've been saying very clearly today that I'm very happy to meet any of the Caribbean High Commissioners who are here for the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting. I've been in correspondence with the Barbadian High Commissioner, and my message to him is that I'm taking these concerns very seriously. I want to get this right.
He says that the government hasn't taken it seriously enough, that this is a real crisis. And he says he thinks part of the reason is because the West Indian community, in his words, has always acted with a certain amount of deference to this country. In other words, they haven't kicked up enough of a fuss.
Well, I think what I would say is I want to send a message to the West Indian community. We invited you here. We wanted you to come to the UK and help us rebuild after the Second World War. We absolutely have a duty to make sure that those who haven't had their status regularised, and there may well be many of them, have the opportunity now. Come and get in contact with the Home Office. We're setting up dedicated contact lines and senior caseworkers who I have instructed to treat all of these cases as sympathetically and sensitively as possible.
But the High Commissioner said that in many cases people had contacted the Home Office, asked for information to help them regularise their status, and they were detained. They're in detention.
And I am very conscious that we have made some mistakes, which we cannot continue to make, and I'm determined that we won't, because these people have contributed an enormous amount, and just because they don't have a passport or can't prove how long they've been here, we should be treating them with sensitivity and sympathy and not detaining them.
Right, what's going to happen to those people who've been detained?
Well, we're working very hard to make sure that they have the opportunity to get in contact with us so they can talk about... From detention? Well, I'm determined to see them out of detention and able to have a dialogue with us. So we're not asking them for 4 proofs of evidence that they've been here for every year that they have, but saying, look, work with us, help us build up a picture of your life in the UK, and we will do our bit, working with HMRC, with the DWP, to establish those records which may not be available at first hand to the individuals concerned.
Do you need to apologise?
Oh, I think I've been very clear how sorry I am about this whole situation. These are people who we have welcomed to our country, who we relied upon after the Second World War to help rebuild. So of course I'm sorry. I'm sorry for all of the individual heartbreaking cases, and we have to do better.
Is the policy going to change?
Well, we're absolutely working to make sure that people don't hit that barrier of being asked for 4 pieces of proof for every year. We just want them to be able to build up a story of their life in the UK with senior caseworkers who are experienced and are going to be making decisions that are sensitive and sympathetic. I think it's really important that we look at all of those barriers. And one of the barriers I'm prepared to accept is cultural. So actually, this is me saying, the Home Office wants you to make contact. We are going to help. Don't be afraid, because my message is one of reassurance. We owe a great deal to these people, and we must make sure that we get it right going forward.
Right, so the government's changing its mind on this, isn't it? You're going to change the policy in order to ensure that future mistakes aren't made.
We absolutely want to make sure that we avoid future mistakes. So we are carefully considering all of these cases only with senior caseworkers to make sure that we have the right people looking at them. And we're saying, look, 4 types of proof for every year, potentially since the 1950s or 60s, is far too much. We just want people to give us what records that they have, work with us so we can work with the DVLA, with DWP, HMRC, to build up a picture of their time here, so that we aren't asking for this onerous burden of proof to a generation who we wanted to come.
The High Commissioner said it demonstrated a lack of compassion on the part of the British government. Do you agree?
Well, I'm trying to be as compassionate as I possibly can be with each individual case that is drawn to my attention. And I would urge those people who haven't yet been in touch, please do get in touch, because that's the only way we can help you.
But there had been a lack of it up until now.
Well, I'm working very hard to make sure that we get decisions right in the future. I think it's really important that we reflect upon a generation of people who we invited to our country and who have lived here, contributed to our communities, contributed to our economy for decades. So we have a duty to get this right.
Thank you. Immigration Minister Caroline Nokes. And while we've been on air, Number 10 has confirmed the Prime Minister will hold a meeting with other heads of Commonwealth governments to discuss concerns about the Windrush generation of immigrants. Johnny Mercer, you can hear the sound of tyres screeching on the tarmac in a massive U-turn on this issue.
Yeah, you can. Look, there's nothing... I know we hammer politicians for sort of making U-turns and changing their mind. Clearly something's gone wrong there. Caroline Nokes, she's been brilliant with this, come out, faced it up, and we've, ended up doing the right thing. Why we have made that decision in the first place, no one can answer. But the key with all this stuff and with all this policy is that you get there in the end, and we're going to get there today.
Yeah, but what about the suffering along the way and the distress that has been caused? I mean, do you think the government has looked callous and unfeeling over this?
I think the government hasn't looked as though it's having its finest hour on the Windrush generation, but we have. You've seen that statement from Number 10. You've seen Caroline Nokes, who's been brilliant on this. She's come out, she's faced it down. And let's end up making sure we do the right thing. The trouble is, if we always go after politicians when things change, right, they're never going to look at the evidence and change something. So let's be pleased that we've ended up at the right decision and make sure we look after these people who've contributed and were asked to contribute to this country all those years ago.
It sounds like it's going to be rectified. And you heard there the Immigration Minister saying that the burden of proof that they were asking for is now going to be reduced. They are going to meet with the heads of government ahead of the Commonwealth meeting. Is that enough?
Joe, these are the people who built our railways, who run the NHS, still do, many of them, who fed our children school meals all those years, who became doctors and nurses, who then ran our businesses and kept our police force and all the other things going. And I just feel that this is an appalling way to treat people. I've had people in my advice surgery in tears because their elderly relatives have been treated in an abominable way. I mean, in detention. Detained after you've done those crucial roles. That's just a disgrace, and it's another mistake by this government.
So have they done the right thing now? Are they going to sort this out? Are you reassured by that?
Well, I don't know whether Johnny has much immigration casework in his constituency, but the Home Office decision-making is of very low quality. The caseworkers are not paid enough, so they attract very low-paid staff, and we end up having very poor decisions. I mean, 50% of all Home Office decisions are overturned at appeal. What does that say about the original quality of the decision-making? Not very much.
Johnny?
Well, clearly there's work to do on that, and you know, our objective as constituency MPs, as you said, is to highlight these cases and make sure we get the right answer in the end. You know, I'm not going to defend what has come out overnight on this. I made my position very clear last night that I thought this was the wrong thing to do, and I'm pleased to see the government is.
It's not a very good way to get Trogham off to a good start.
All right, let's leave it there for now. 2018 so far has sadly already been marked by a spike in the number of murders in London and a rise in knife crime across England and Wales. But why are young men carrying knives, and what is the impact on local communities? Edward Adoub, now a presenter on BBC Local Radio, made a film for us 3 years ago. He's gone back to North London to find out what's changed.
I've come back to where I grew up, in Kentish Town, North London. I'm going to take you on a journey down a street I know very well. My first stop is a shop at one end of the street where the owner has experienced knife crime firsthand.
On that particular day, I was upstairs having a lunch and my daughter was in the shop. I heard a commotion, so I came running down and I saw 3 people attacking this person in the shop. Initially, I thought they were just having a fight, and then I saw the knives and the blood. So I started trying to scream and stop and press the button for the police.
And where was your daughter?
I couldn't see her initially, but then when I went behind the counter, I saw there's a little cupboard, the stair cupboard. She was hiding under there.
Bill's experience was 10 years ago, but some people think the violence has been getting worse in the last couple of years. In 2018, there have been 50 killings already in the capital, which has put knife and gun crime back in the headlines. For me, it's personal. My head teacher, Philip Lawrence, was stabbed at the gate of his school as he went to the aid of one of his pupils. At the time, it shocked the nation. So why, after 23 years, is the pain of knife crime still with us? Further down the street, I bumped into Omar, who was very keen to show me the scene of some recent violence. I was shocked at what he had to say.
I'm walking up there from the shops, reach here, right here, right there.
So this is where they gathered?
Yeah. And I hear the bikes coming from there behind me.
Yeah.
2 bikes.
Yeah.
And I reach here, exactly in the middle of the square. Yeah. The local boys sitting there smoking, little kids playing, whatever. Normal day of the week. And then them 2 guys on the bike drop there, right in the centre of that.
Yeah.
Got off the bikes, get the swords, and start egging the people. Come on, right here. On broad day in the afternoon. At night, you hear them on the motorbikes, yeah. When you hear the motorbikes, you know it's kicking off.
So literally they ride the bikes along.
Everywhere, here, through the estate, because to hide from the police. What are they going to do?
After speaking to Omar, I met some police officers patrolling the area. They took me to a spot round the back of one of the estates, which is used by gang members to stash knives.
I mean, there's nothing. Usually we find stuff down here, but you can see we found about, I think one week we found, I think 3 knives in 3 days, like one every day.
Wow. And you mentioned a machete as well.
Yeah, that was here up top as well.
Knife crime is a community problem which is widespread. Feuds in different pockets of London and across the UK, it's fueled by socio-economic problems.
It angers me when I hear the issue put down to stereotypes. It's not just a black-on-black problem. So where do we go from here? Perhaps part of the answer lies at the end of the street. I've gone to meet my old friend Gemma. She set up a community group, Save Our Boys, Save Our Girls.
Oh my word, how you doing? Good to see you. Blaster, the fast, my brother, how you doing? Good to see you. Yeah, man, good to see you.
She's here with some of the people she works with, Tamika and Frost.
Gosh, this takes me back. Like, I had my confirmation party here, my brother had his christening. I can still smell the food as well, the jollof rice. But you know what, I mean, what is going on at the moment here? Is this crazy? I've heard about all the dramas that have been going on. And
it comes to our attention, especially on Facebook, that, you know, there was stabbings happening. So as they were happening, it was sort of going on live, you know, people updating their statuses. And I thought, I can't sit back and just watch this anymore. I feel like I have to do something. So we've got, you know, an array of opportunities, programs, training, help. So,
do you know anyone who's been affected, who's been caught up in the madness?
My friend, his brother, sadly passed away a week or 2 ago from knife violence, and he used to work with me as well. So there was a lot of impact, and he was like family to all of us.
You have to be onto your kids. You have to know what they're doing. Sometimes you might have to even search your children Wow. That's the level that we're at. You
Have you had
understand
to
what I'm
do
saying?
that?
I've had to search my sons. Do you know what I mean? And it's a fact of life.
How
do
does
you know
that
what I
make
mean?
you feel as a parent, having
Well,
to do that?
how am I going to feel to bury my kid? Do you know what I mean? It's like, what are you going to do? Police your kid or bury your kid? It's one of the two, man. Do you know what I mean? And it's that bad out here now. I think the only solution is through education and through giving these young people opportunities to change their life around. Do you know what I mean?
A very poignant film there. Ed Adu is here in the studio with us now. You went back to the place where you grew up. Yeah. You spoke to lots of people that you knew from that time and up-to-date police officers, community workers. What do you think has caused this latest spike in knife crime in London?
I think a lot of the youths are bored. A lot of people have said, it's down to youth centres closing down, or it's down to mothers, fathers not being there, and potential gangs being their kind of the surrogate families to them. But I think from when I went to Queen's Crescent and I saw what was going on there, it seems that the whole area is disenfranchised, the people not connected. And it's not just about people, I think it's also particular communities as well, people from different backgrounds, like the Somalian community as well. They feel that there's no connection with the authorities and the community. And I think certain people have been ignored, and that's the problem. But I think it's down to boredom as well. I mean, a lot of people said, OK, reinvest, get people back into youth clubs. But I was talking to my brother and friends about it, and they said, listen, you reinvest in youth clubs, people still take guns and knives into youth clubs. So that's not the issue, the fundamental problem. The issue, it's down to parenting, because what are kids doing late at night after 10 o'clock, hanging around, loitering in street corners, fast food. I mean, even in my part of town, when I'm driving on the bus and I look into my local McDonald's or Burger King, I'm thinking, there's 20 kids in there. So these fast food places have turned into youth clubs, and that shouldn't be the case.
So you've identified in your mind the problem, or part of the problem, disenfranchised groups of youngsters who don't feel perhaps part of society, or it's not there for them. What's the solution? The
solution is to connect with them, and through what they do, and also role models. And everyone says, oh, you know, Stormzy, Skepta, the grime community, music. It's beyond that. It's trying to figure out why they act like that, why they putting knives and guns in their pocket. And it's beyond the police and councils. I think it's for everyone to get together and to figure out how we can challenge this, and to say, well, look, we need to kind of tap into their brains to figure out that mindset, because it's part of a throwaway culture now, where it's beyond the statistics. I mean, 55 now in London. Since Christmas. They don't seem to care.
No, the statistics are shocking, certainly in recent times. Well, Ed, stay with us, because we're going to go to Glasgow and talk to John Carnickan. He's a former police officer credited with helping tackle violence in the city, which was once known as Europe's murder capital. John, I don't know if you were able to listen to Ed there. Do you agree with him that the problem is around boredom, it's around groups of youngsters who are disenfranchised, and the solution is trying to connect with these youngsters and make them feel their self-worth?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I mean, humans are born connected and they stay connected. When a baby's born and mum's oxytocin spikes, it's so they can connect, and that's what we're built for. We're built for relationships. And when there's a breakdown in relationships and disconnection, that's how it's acted out in the streets. And I think it's important too to think about violence, not just about knife crime. Take crime out of the equation. This is about violence. And if you think about this, people don't learn how to be violent. They learn how not to be violent. So the early years are hugely important, where you learn to communicate, negotiate, to compromise. You learn to problem solve, and you learn about relationships. So the absence of positive male role models is hugely important. But connection is the big thing. I mean, if I only had 5 seconds with you, I'd say the answer to everything is relationships.
What about, though, the specifics in Glasgow? What was it that turned it around there?
Well, I think we were like London. We were at that stage where we didn't think it could get any worse, and what we'd been doing hadn't made any difference whatsoever. So we decided to do something entirely different, which was to look at it from a health perspective and through that lens. And that allowed us a whole new lexicon of things to talk about. Because first of all, what we did, using a public health model, is we tried to understand what the data told us, what the evidence said, not the crime figures. Because in relation to crime figures, only between 1/3 and 1/2 of people who turn up at A&Es as a result of violence will report it to the police. So you're actually asking commissioners and chief officers to make decisions based on half of the evidence. And it's never going to work. We are the service of last resort. Policing is the service of last resort. So the failure of demand in a whole range of other places, starting in homes and communities and with agencies, means that the point of impact is where the police work and where E&E works.
Right. And is that about resources and money?
Oh, I think that there's certainly something around the notion of resources. I mean, if you have fewer social workers, if you have fewer police officers, fewer probation officers, fewer CAMS teams and health service, fewer health visitors, collectively, the same as the reasons that violence happens are complex and multiple. The solutions are exactly the same. So there's no doubt failure demand through all these services will have an impact. More importantly, in terms of policing, they have a serious impact on how you respond to it. So take it out the equation about did it cause it. Think about, well, how do you respond to it? And you can't respond to it unless you establish relationships. And that's about police and relationships and communities. And if police are only responding to calls, if the only time they meet young people is when they're stopping and searching them, then that's wrong. You need time to establish relationships.
Stay with Catherine West. You're a London MP. You've listened to both Ed and John. Can you learn something from what they've said?
Yes, and I've got a meeting with Amber Rudd about this because there was a flyby shooting outside the cinema in my constituency in Wood Green, and followed by a revenge attack in David Lammy's constituency, and it's a tit-for-tat thing, but it's about the drugs at the top and the big boys. They're driving a lot of this, and they're using the young people in a sort of really ugly scene of almost trafficking them. Having said all that, I do think that Amber should rethink the 320 million, which is going to be taken out even more from the Met, because we say that this is mainly in certain groups. Actually, even in our more sort of nicer bits of the neighbourhood, like, you know, Muswell Hill, crowded, packed meeting the other night on crime, as in Highgate, you know, people coming in, stealing phones, stealing this, because they know that there's no police there to come and stop them.
Right, let me get a comment from Johnny Mercer. One of the things that people say is that youngsters are carrying knives to protect themselves. That's what they always say. We're only doing it because we are worried about being attacked. How do you break that psychology?
Well, I think, you know, you've got to listen to these guys with everything you can. They've been out there, they've done it, they've got their hands dirty. I think when it comes to resources and so on, I mean, Amber has directly answered that question. That's for her to answer. But I do think we, in this country at the moment, whether it is health or issues like this, we generally sort of look at those symptoms and think, how are we going to tackle that without looking at the underlying causes all the time? So it's exactly the same in health. How are we going to encourage people to live healthier lives? How are we going to encourage the relationships that we're hearing about today? And until we have a more strategic approach towards solving those issues, I think it's going to be an uphill battle.
I've heard interviews on various radio stations with people who have set up groups like Save Our Boys, Save Our Girls, who have tried to reach out to Amber Rudd and to her department, to the Home Office, and to say, listen, what can we can help. We've got the keys to this, but they feel that they've been ignored. Isn't it time for those discussions to be had with Amber Rudd and with those organisations to say, well, look, let's get together and let's clamp down on this?
Yeah, clearly. I mean, you know, I can't answer for Amber, and I know that she is, you know, she cares about this stuff and she will want to get it right. So I'll speak to her after this and mention that I've seen you today.
Oh, well, then the community.
Right. Well, you've got a pledge there from Johnny Mercer, so you should hold him to that.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for coming in. John, thank you in Glasgow. Now, do you fancy another vote on the subject of Brexit? Not another one, as Brenda might... Oh, yes, not another one, as Brenda from Bristol might have said. Well, yesterday, a group of MPs, celebrities and business leaders launched a campaign calling for a public vote on the final Brexit deal between the UK and the European Union. The People's Vote aims to unite anti-Brexit groups and is at pains to say it's not calling for another referendum. So, do people want another vote? Well, that depends on how you ask the question, according to the polls. Earlier this month, when YouGov asked the public whether they should have the final say on the deal, 44% said they should, while 36% said that they should not. However, when YouGov asked a slightly different question on whether there should be a public vote on the deal, 39% said there should be, while 45% said that there should not be. Well, we're joined now by Will Dry from the movement Our Future or Choice. That's one of the groups involved. Welcome to the programme.
Our Future, Our Choice, sorry.
Oh, what did I say?
Our Choice, don't worry.
Our Choice, but thank you for correcting me. This is another referendum, isn't it?
No, I don't think so at all. I'll get right to it. I voted Leave in the first referendum. And I think that what we're seeing now is a totally different proposition to what was on the table in 2016. So, for example, I think the crucial question is, when you have a vote, do you just look at the conclusion of a vote, or do you accept that there are certain conditions attached to the conclusion of a vote which also have to be delivered?
But that's been added retrospectively, isn't it?
No, I don't think so at all. So, for example, the Leave campaign campaigned heavily on the fact that we would get more trade. But now I think it's quite clear that we're going to get less trade. The Prime Minister said so in her speech. We're going to put up barriers between ourselves and our major trading partners. The Leave campaign campaigned heavily on having a better NHS. But since the referendum, we've seen a record number of EU nurses and doctors leaving the country, and I don't see a provision in her deal for 350 million extra for the NHS.
So, as a Leaver, I mean, are you quite unique in the campaign group as a Leaver who is now advocating another vote?
I think there is a growing movement of people who are looking at what's on the table and feeling, hang on, I did not legitimise that. I did not legitimise less money for the NHS. I did not legitimise my country being a rule taker for 2 years and probably longer after that. And saying that, look, it's sensible to have a people's vote on whatever the final deal is that Theresa May comes back with.
Right. I mean, if people... Let's say there was a vote on the terms of the final deal, and people vote no, we would still be in the EU as far as you're concerned, wouldn't we?
Well, look, I don't want to preempt what the question would be. I think that's a job for Catherine and Johnny. But think,
surely you have to have decided what that's going to be your campaigning on it.
I think it would be deeply irresponsible for Parliament to put no deal on the ballot paper, because no deal, in my view, is planes don't fly. We have suddenly these overnight, there's huge tariffs, people lose their rights overnight. So I think it would be deeply irresponsible for no deal to be on the ballot. But, you know, this campaign is purely about giving the people a choice to decide whether or not this deal is good enough for our country's future.
Which would be in or out, then?
Which would be accepting the deal and going ahead with Brexit, or staying within the European Union, yes, I would say.
Right, but that, in effect, is in or out, isn't it? That is then another referendum on a different question, but the effect would be the same.
Well, you can analyse it whatever way you want. In my view, it's a people's vote on deciding whether or not this deal is good enough for our country's future, for our family's future, for my generation's future. I don't think it is. Hence, when we have this people's vote, I'm going to vote against the deal.
You voted to remain.
Yeah.
But you've accepted Brexit. Yeah. What about what Will is saying? I mean, there was no detail about how we would leave, what would happen. So, you know, do you buy what he's saying?
There's a couple of things I don't accept. I don't accept that people don't know what they were voting for. I think you can apply that almost retrospectively to any election when things come out afterwards and you say, well, you know, that wasn't quite in detail. I think people very clearly voted. They knew that there was going to be a difficult period. They knew that there was... OK, that's fine, and I respect that. But I think they knew there was going to be a difficult period. They knew that there were going to have to be discussions and so on. I think that the meaningful vote in Parliament is important, what the Prime Minister has said is going to happen, but that's what MPs get paid for. I don't think the country wants another vote. They certainly don't want another vote in Plymouth. What? We're to scrutinise this deal that is coming forward, and the Prime Minister said that's going to happen.
If I can just jump in for 1 second, that's actually not true. There was a recent poll which said 52% of people do want a people's vote. There was actually a newspaper article in the Plymouth Herald which said that Plymouth has changed its mind on Brexit. I think there is a deep desire in this country to ensure that Brexit is not a disaster, which a lot of people are fearing it will be.
But despite what you say, Catherine, it is true that there has not been a major shift in terms of whether people would vote in or out in another referendum.
Well, in a referendum, you don't need everybody to vote the same way, do you? Because in the end, you want some people in the middle to shift to either of the positions to give us clarity.
But there hasn't been a demonstration of that major shift.
Well, I think what we have to do is in Parliament, we have to do our job, but also we have to listen to young people. It's really important that we listen to young people because it's their future, and also we have to look at the economy. JLR, Jaguar Land Rover, losing 1,000 jobs this week.
We're going to have to finish it there. I know it was a big subject to end on, but Will, thank you very much. Our Future, Our Choice for coming in. From all of us here, goodbye. And the 1 o'clock news is starting over on BBC One now. Bye-bye.